Hi, today we're covering Marvin Heemeyer and the Killdozer. If you end up enjoying or seeing value in anything that I've made, all I ask is that you please like and subscribe because it really helps me. Marvin was just your average guy living in Granby, Colorado. And while he was not some big shot entrepreneur type, and more often than not, just lived well enough to make ends meet, he poured his blood, sweat, and tears into his muffler repair shop, working day in and out just to keep it afloat. It all began back in 1992 when Marvin bought 2 acres of land for $42,000. And why was this? It was so he could build his own little muffler repair shop and carve out his own slice of the American dream. And at this point, people in town seemed to rather like him. His friends thought he was a stand-up guy, and he was noted to always be ready to lend a hand. And even his brother would go on to state that regardless of what he did or thought, Marvin was the type of guy to go the extra mile for people he knew, and even those he didn't. However, the good times seemed as if they were not meant to last, as things would take a turn for the worse. Marvin would run into some trouble with the neighboring business and the town's council. It seemed that they had some rather blatant animosity towards Marvin, to the point that even after the Kildozer incident, many still believe that the town council and the business itself were actively antagonizing Marvin to get him to act out. And well, unfortunately for them, he acted out a bit more than they probably expected. And while most people would probably just pack up and move on, that wasn't how Marvin would deal with things. No, he had other plans. Plans that involved a little something that would be called the Killdozer. Yeah, you heard that right. Marvin went full orc and turned a bulldozer into his personal wrecking ball of vengeance. I mean, the guy was a rather good mechanic and had the technical knowledge to do so, but can you imagine upsetting someone so much that they would up-armor a bulldozer with layers upon layers of steel and concrete, only to go on a rampage through the town, targeting the very buildings, businesses, and individuals, places of operation that had wronged him, like it was out of a movie. But here's the thing, while revenge might seem sweet at the moment, especially when you feel like you're being targeted by people unfairly and being systematically disenfranchised, seeing as Marvin is no longer with us, kinda shows that he really couldn't enjoy his revenge, regardless of how cathartic it was. So let's dive right into the story of Marvin Heemeyer and his legendary Killdozer. So back in the day, Marvin was able to snag a prime piece of real estate from the Resolution Trust Corporation for a tidy sum of $42,000. Now, while it wasn't exactly pocket change, this would allow Marvin to have what many would call prime real estate for a business. And that's exactly what Marvin was intending to use it for. But you see, Martin's story and how he gained the funds to start his business, along with the skills that allowed him to create the Killdozer, do not seem like your typical tale. Since after he served in the US Air Force for over 2 decades, he would go on to hang up his uniform in 1969, and he would quickly pick up a new skill, which would later lend to the creation of the Killdozer, welding. And all his years in the Air Force seemingly had also taught him a thing or two about taking charge and making things happen. So when the opportunity arose to be his own boss, Marvin didn't hesitate to take it. Then fast forward to 1992, and Marvin is now living his dream, running his own muffler shop on that little parcel of land which he had scrimped and saved to buy. And business was booming, at least for a while, allowing Marvin to gain the reputation of the go-to guy for muffler repairs in the town. He would even dabble in some cosmetic fixes for the property and expand his services along with his customer base. But as the new millennium rolled around, trouble began to brew. And around 1997, word would get out that the Dochef family had their eye on a vacant lot next to Martin's shop, and they had big plans to make a massive concrete batch plant. Now this did not sit well with Marvin. Not only had he outbid a member of this family, Cody, years ago when buying his own parcel of land, which had inevitably left some bad blood between them, but the new development plan threatened to completely cut off access to his shop, so negotiations would quickly kick off. between Martin and the Duchess clan, and it seems that talks would drag on, with both sides trying or at least pretending to attempt to find common ground. They even hashed out a deal where Marvin would sell his property for a hefty $250,000 price tag, and this seems like a rather sweet deal considering he had bought the property for a fraction of that price back in 1992. But as we'll soon see, things weren't quite as they seemed. So as Cody and Marvin seemed to reach an agreement to sell the property for $250,000, it seemed Marvin had a change of heart, or that this deal was supposed to be so outrageous that they would just turn it down. First, he decides he wants more cash in his pocket, increasing the price to $357,000. Much to Marvin's surprise, Cody agreed to the new terms. However, in a move that seems like he was trying to give a "I don't want to sell" number, Marvin would jack up the price to a whopping $1 million. And it's here that communication would seemingly hit a brick wall as the deal fell through. Now here's where things get really messy, and where people's suspicions about potential bribery or some under-the-table business happening begin to crop up. Because in 2001, despite Marvin's objections, the zoning commission and the town's trustees give the green light for the construction of the cement plant. And Marvin was fuming because not only would he have to deal with the Duchess family, but he was now facing the prospect of being permanently cut off from his own livelihood. And Marvin was not one to go down without a fight. He would throw everything he had into battling against the decision, shelling out $150,000 on legal fees. He even went as far as to hire an attorney who dealt with this type of case in order to appeal the town's ruling. But he was basically told to pound sand, and the appeal went nowhere, leaving Marvin high and dry. So at this point, Marvin was basically kicked while he was down due to the whole concrete plant debacle. And it seems that rather than leave him be subsumed under the costs and the effects of the concrete plant, the people in charge decided to pour salt on the wound, fining him a whopping $2,500 for a laundry list of minor violations. They claimed he had junk cars cluttering up his property, and if we're honest, that's just part and parcel of running a repair shop. You're gonna have messed up cars, generally junk parts and other such things. But if that wasn't enough, they decided to call him out for not being hooked up to the sewer line. But get this, it's the city and the concrete plant who had cut off his utilities. This was in order to make room to make the cement plant itself. Things such as this make it hard to argue against the accusation that the city was intentionally trying to screw Marvin over. It was to the point that, regardless of what he told them, they refused to turn it back on. And they told him he needed to find some way to connect to the sewage line. But guess who owned the land that the sewage line needed to go through? You guessed it, it was Cody and the concrete plant family. And as you could guess, they did not want to allow Marvin to have a moment's peace, or even permission to run a pipe that the city's telling him to run under their precious concrete plant. And now Marvin's feeling like he's been kicked repetitively by the town and thrown under the bus by the local government, and he's on the brink. His business teetering on the edge of collapse, but Marvin would still not give up. The fact that his muffler shop now had little to no access to the road, which was strangling his business, was something that Marvin believed he himself could fix. So he bought the equipment, including a bulldozer, concrete, tar, and everything else he would need to build a path between the main road and his shop. And he offered to build it himself so he could continue on with his business. But once again, the local government decided to squash that. It would only be them who were allowed to zone any property to be used to build a road, even Marvin's own property. So essentially, now that he was out of luck, he had to come up with something quick. So he started to lease his garage to a trash company. And for a while that was awesome. It worked. He was making ends meet. And before you know it, he wound up selling the garage itself for a cool $400,000. But at this time, it seemed Marvin was keeping something close to the vest, and that would be his master plan. So after Marvin had sold off his property to the new owners, they would give him a few months to pack up and leave. But instead of wallowing in despair, Marvin saw an opportunity. He had a bulldozer, military experience, and plenty of materials just sitting there in the garage, and no place to put them. But Marvin saw this as a sign. Instead of trying to rid himself of both the building and the bulldozer, he would end up using both. It seemed desperate times called for desperate measures, and Marvin would get to work. For about a year and a half, from 2003 to mid-2004, he would pour all his energy into transforming his Komatsu bulldozer into a veritable moving fortress, basically a gnarly tank. And he didn't just up-armor it, the other modifications he made were no joke. Along with the armored sarcophagus he would build that would cover not only the engine and the cabin, but part of the tracks, in layers of concrete and thick metal plates, resembling Chobham armor, but of a lower quality and 12 inches thick. He would install cameras all around the vehicle, each one encased in layers of bulletproof glass, and he even installed compressed air nozzles in order to keep these cameras clear, and an air conditioner to beat the heat. But let's not forget how he basically turned it into a tank by adding in a myriad of gun ports, each one reinforced with thick steel plates, each enough to stop a bullet in and of itself. And here's the kicker. Marvin documented every step of this process, making detailed audio recordings along the way. And when it came time to lower the sarcophagus onto the bulldozer, he did it with precision using a crane he had bought and set up himself. And once the sarcophagus was lowered, he would never be able to lift it off himself. It was a one-way trip, and Marvin knew it. Now, locked, loaded, and ready for action, Marvin would be able to take on anything and everything short of the military that stood in his way. This would be a bold move, one that he could not come back from. And in one of history's most bizarre acts of defiance ever seen, Marvin set off on his last-ditch effort to get revenge and take from those who he clearly saw as having taken unjustly from him. Killdozer would now be on the move, and the rampage began on June 4th, 2004, and it began with a bang as he literally crashed through the wall of his own shop, steering his homemade tank straight towards the concrete plant. And at this point, Cody would look on in disbelief as Marvin would lay waste to their entire building, leaving naught but destruction in his wake. With the police now hot on his trail, Marvin barrels his way down the highway, shrugging off shotgun and rifle fire as if it were nothing, eventually plowing through Mountain Park Electric and demolishing Maple Street builders. Marvin's bulldozer was essentially an unstoppable force of nature, as he maneuvered it with military-like precision, blocking off roads to those who followed him, meaning that many in the town had to just watch in horror. But it seems like this was something that no one saw coming, even though everybody understood that he was being destroyed by the town itself, due to his business falling apart, his life being in ruins, mourning the extremely recent loss of his father, and on top of that, while the concrete plant and the city council is destroying his life, his fiancée decides to cheat on him. So he had a list of names now, and everyone was worried that they were on it. His first target in the town proper was the town hall, along with a utility center, and even the offices of a newspaper that had rubbed him the wrong way in the way that they were covering his case. But Marvin wasn't done yet. He would take aim at a hardware store, along with the home of the former mayor, which was now occupied by his widow, and several other properties that belonged to individuals who had crossed him. To add insult to injury, Marvin used the guns he had installed on the bulldozer to shoot at propane tanks and electrical transformers, reaping even more havoc. And when the concrete plant family attempted to stop him with vehicles, Marvin just bulldozed right through them. They even used a scraper to attempt to stop the Killdozer, but a scraper couldn't really match up to the power of a bulldozer. Naturally, when the cops failed to wrangle Marvin in, SWAT teams were called in to join the fray. Marvin hadn't even made it hard for them to find him, since he just created a path of destruction as he was headed directly towards the police's headquarters. And in a matter of minutes, the headquarters were reduced to rubble. But here's the crazy part. In this streak of destruction, not a single soul was hurt. Now, the question of was it intentional or unintentional that Marvin wound up not killing a soul or even hurting them is one that we'll never have answered. And Marvin's next targets would include Liberty's Savings Bank and Sky High News. However, once again, the residents were evacuated as the area was, for all intensive purposes, in a state of emergency. Marvin had up-armored his bulldozer to the teeth, and the police even attempted to throw in smoke grenades and concussive grenades, but it did nothing. It got to the point that the police stopped shooting because their bullets were just ricocheting off of its armor. And eventually, Marvin tried to take out another series of propane tanks, but fortunately for everyone involved, it seemed that these propane tanks were in the line of particular gun ports that were just too small, causing the bullets to ricochet off of the gun port's opening. It had gotten so extreme that the governor was actually considering and attempting to get a line on a Apache helicopter to have the Killdozer blasted into oblivion, but that seemed unnecessary, as eventually Marvin's rampage would reach its climax as he faced off against copycat printing. While laying waste to copycat printing, disaster struck for Kildozer. One of his anti-freeze lines blew, and smoke started billowing out from the machine, which was a relatively small problem for Marvin, as he pressed on, targeting another company which had supposedly slandered him. Up next would be the Gambles. However, as he started to destroy the site, a construction worker would block his path, but as he swerved to miss him, swerved being a relative term, Marvin would have no choice but to plow forward in another direction, especially since the Killdozer's power was now failing. But here's where things took a really bad turn for the worse. The building he was now tearing through had a basement, and when the basement ceiling collapsed, it took one of the Killdozer's tracks with it, leaving Marvin high and dry, stuck. With the Killdozer now immobilized, and Marvin running out of options, he would make a fateful decision. And after a year and a half of seeking revenge, he realized he had nothing left. His livelihood gone, his family gone, and his fiancée also gone, and with only prison looming on the horizon, Marvin decided to take matters into his own hands, terminating himself with a pistol. Eventually, it would take police and specialist teams over 7 hours and a cutting torch to finally breach Killdozer's armor and gain access to the interior. Now in the aftermath of Marvin's rampage, and despite authorities' best efforts, including firing over 600 bullets, explosives, and flashbangs, they would just find Marvin's body lifeless inside, so there would be no trial. Also inside, they would discover a video camera and 3 monitors that he had been using to navigate during his path of destruction, and amongst his belongings were a series of weapons, bottles of sparkling water, and a fan, showing that Marvin expected this to be his final journey. Remarkably, despite the damage and destruction to 13 buildings, no one besides Marvin was harmed. And inside his ruined muffler shop, the police found audio tapes where Marvin explained his motives, and in one of his tapes, he expressed his frustrations at not being heard and his belief that leaving the world was the only way to settle his debt. In the wake of the devastation, the community would rally together, and fundraisers would be organized to rebuild the damaged properties, with the final bill totaling over $7 million. Some locals would eventually even suggest turning Marvin's bulldozer into a tourist attraction. However, this idea was ultimately discarded and the Killdozer destroyed. And it was in 2005 that the town council announced that the Killdozer would be sent to be scrapped, with its parts dispersed to various scrapyards in order to prevent them from becoming souvenirs. And at the end of the day, Marvin's actions have divided opinions, with some branding him a lunatic, while others see him as someone who fought back against a system that had wronged him, like many wish to do. Whether it was by luck or design, the fact that no lives were taken in Marvin's rampage seems to bolster the cause of Marvin not being a lunatic, but rather someone who fought back against injustice. Marvin Heemeyer's rampage has left a lasting impact on Granby, Colorado, along with turning the Killdozer and Marvin himself into a symbol of resistance against a system which has failed many. However, the aftermath of his actions brought the community closer together and served as a cautionary tale about the consequences of what happens when someone is brought to their breaking point, leaving a rather contradictory legacy that has provoked discussion and reflection on the limits of individual agency in the face of perceived injustice. If you remained with me until the end, I thank you, and I do hope you stay tuned and subscribe for more content.